Today's scripture passage is Genesis 39, chapter 39, verses 20b through 48. Yeah, that's right. Okay. You're invited to turn there in your Bibles or on your phone, or you can follow on the screen behind me. But while Joseph was there in prison, the Lord was with him. He showed him kindness and granted him favor in the eyes of the prison warden. So the warden put Joseph in charge of all those held in prison, and he was made responsible for all that was done there. The warden paid no attention to anything under Joseph's care, because the Lord was with Joseph and gave him success in whatever he did. Sometime later, the cupbearer and the baker of the king of Egypt offended their master, the king of Egypt. Pharaoh was angry with his two officials, the chief cupbearer and the chief baker, and put them in custody in the house of the captain of the guard, in the same prison where Joseph was confined. The captain of the guard assigned them to Joseph, and he attended them. After they had been in custody for some time, each of the two men, the cupbearer and the baker of the king of Egypt, who were being held in prison, had a dream the same night, and each dream had a meaning of its own. When Joseph came to them the next morning, he saw that they were dejected. So he asked Pharaoh's officials who were in custody with him in his master's house, "Why do you look sad today?" "We both had dreams," they answered, "but there is no one to interpret them." This is God's word.
So as we continue winding our way through the narrative of the life of this man, Joseph, who lived roughly 4,000 years ago, half a planet apart from us, we are seeing ways in which his experience is important to us today. It's kind of a mind-boggling thought to think about the fact that somebody who lived so long ago could walk with the same God that you are walking with today, or the same God that you have the opportunity to walk with today. And you can actually learn about a relationship with God by looking at this guy's life. And it's so kind of God to give us a window into a life like this, because Joseph was a pretty special man, an extraordinary man. Now, think about this. Joseph has been dealt yet another tragic gut punch, another very difficult thing in life to handle. If you remember, we saw last week that he had been thrown into prison, and that's where we find him today. We'll find him today. We pick up the narrative with Joseph having been thrown in prison. Now, remember, formerly, he had been trafficked into human slavery by his own brothers. They trafficked in him. And some Midianite slave traders purchased him from his brothers, and they took him to a foreign land where Joseph didn't know anybody, any language, he didn't know any of the culture, and there he finds himself sold by these Midianite slave traders to a wealthy Egyptian man, where he is taken home and put to work as a slave in this man's house. Now, what is weird to think about is Joseph finds himself in the situation, and yet he serves faithfully, he serves loyally, he serves diligently and very respectfully to this man who has bought him as a slave. And then on a particular day, well, I shouldn't say on a particular day, what happens is that since Joseph is young and he's handsome, and the scriptures actually say that he's well built, this man who has purchased him, his wife, starts to come on really strong with him. And she wants to have an affair with him. And so day after day after day, she comes on very strong with him, and Joseph perpetually refuses. Now, the scriptures tell us that what happened was at one point, she got so offended with his refusals that she actually concocted a story which she told to her husband, Joseph's owner, that it was all Joseph's fault, that Joseph was trying to seduce her. And this man that Joseph has served faithfully, loyally, very respectively, chooses to act on what his wife has said is true of Joseph, even though it's not true. And Joseph winds up getting thrown into a dungeon with no chance to even defend himself. So Joseph is having a bad decade. Things are not going well for Joseph, at least on the outside. Which leads me to conclude something I think is generally true. Now, this is not the cheeriest thing that I could ever say to you, but it's the truth. Guys, sometimes living in this world, life is simply unfair. Joseph faced it. Joseph was treated entirely unfairly, in many times and in many ways. And I would tell you this, sometimes obedience to God's will while living in this world is rewarded with what I would call increased difficulty. Now, if you don't like that, I'm sorry, you'd have to rip the story of Joseph out of the Bible. Because Joseph was being obedient to God, and he got thrown into prison for it, falsely accused. That was Joseph's experience. Now, one thing that we are trying to see, and one thing I think that I want us to take away from the story of this man's life and his experiences, is that Joseph navigates these circumstances that would crush the faith of many of us, circumstances that would crush our faith. Joseph navigates them in ways that his spirit does not sour. And I ask myself, how does that happen? And he navigates these life-crushing circumstances in ways that his faith never seems to waver. And the words of Job, these famous words of Job, another sufferer, came to mind as I was thinking about Joseph's experiences here and how life was hard and unfair to him during these days. Job said in his own experience, he said, though he slay me, he's referring to God, though God slay me, yet I will hope in him. And Joseph seemed to have that same kind of faith. And I'm wondering, do you have that same kind of faith? Or are you, unlike Joseph, sort of souring as hardship is piled upon hardship? And I was asking myself, so what made the difference for Joseph? And we've talked about this at a couple of different times, and I want to sort of restate things in another way here, so it might sound new to you. What makes the difference for Joseph? How does he navigate these circumstances? Well, Joseph is convinced, first of all, that God has his life in the palm of his hand at how many times? At all times, not just at some times. Joseph is convinced that this is no accident, that God has not bailed on him. And what struck me this week, because I was thinking about this, Joseph did not seem to equate hard things like this coming into his life with God's displeasure toward him. He does not think that, well, since bad stuff's happening, I must have slipped out of God's will. Joseph never thought that. Joseph never thought to himself, well, God must be punishing me because I'm really having hard circumstances. Joseph never thought those things. He just was convinced that no matter what happened to him, no matter how it appeared on the outside, God had him in the palm of his hand. How about us? Is that true for us? And then something else that I saw that makes a difference for Joseph, since he has this kind of trust in God, that God always has him in the palm of his hand, no matter how things appear on the outside, what does he do then? He continues to look for opportunities and seize opportunities to serve other people, no matter where he winds up and no matter how menial the task. His brothers traffic him as a slave. What does he do? He winds up down in Egypt, and he is bought by a guy who he serves very faithfully and diligently, and he honors him. And then that same guy turns around and hits him in the gut again by throwing him to the prison on trumped-up accusations that were not true. And so now he's an imprisoned slave, and what does he do? He serves the people around him in a very diligent, eager, loving way. Do we learn anything from this? We need to learn something from this because this was Joseph's experience. Now, look at verses 20, the second half of it, through 23. But while Joseph was there in prison, the Lord was with him and showed him kindness and granted him favor in the eyes of the prison warden. So the warden put Joseph in charge of all those held in the prison, and he was made responsible for all that was done there. The warden paid no attention to anything under Joseph's care because the Lord was with Joseph and gave him success in whatever he did. Now, doesn't that sound like deja vu to you? Doesn't it sound like something else? Well, it's precisely what happened to him when he was sold as a slave into Potiphar's house. He started serving. He started being diligent. He was faithful and loyal. And he got more and more responsibility, whether he was asking for it, probably not, but he accepted it as it came to him. And then all of a sudden came the gut punch again. He got thrown into the dungeon for stuff that he'd never done. So if you or I are like Joseph, we're probably a little reluctant to go down that same path again. Well, I was faithful and obedient, and I served and loved people the first time. I got kicked in the stomach for it. I'm not so sure I want to do this again. You ever heard that phrase, once bitten, twice shy? That apparently was not Joseph, because what does he do? He gets kicked in the gut again, and he gets up, and he starts loving and serving the people that are put in his life. And the same pattern ensues. He starts being given more and more responsibility until the next thing you know, he's running a whole stupid prison. This is Joseph. I might have been a little bit reluctant to do that. And I thought, now aren't people taking advantage of Joe? So, in other words, the guy who's supposed to be running the prison doesn't even have to think about it because he's got Joseph here now. And I noticed that, well, apparently Joseph is so humble, he doesn't care about titles. Apparently he's so humble, he's not worried about getting an increase in his pay, because when you're a slave, you don't get paid anyway. When you're a prisoner, you're not getting paid for being a prisoner. Joseph doesn't care about this. He just loves and serves the people who are put in his life, despite the fact that he keeps getting stung over and over again. That really struck me this week. This is the way his experience worked. Now, one of the things I've been saying that you can see from Joseph's story, one of the things I think that is so beautiful about it, is the fact that you can pull back the curtains. Actually, the curtains are pulled back for you. And you can look behind the scenes because you have the benefit of 4,000 years of hindsight. And you can see, as you look back, what God was doing in all of these things. Stuff that Joseph didn't know. Stuff that you and I would never have been able to imagine was going to come from this was in the process of coming from all of this. So here's what I wanted to do with the rest of the way this morning, is show you 4 ways you can see God's providential hand working behind the scenes in Joseph's life. Ways that Joseph did not have an understanding of when it was happening to him, but he trusted God for it anyway. So here's the first way that I think, at least I can see, God's providential hand working in Joseph's being thrown into prison unjustly. Number 1, God was using this for Joseph's own development in a lot of ways. And the first thing I thought about under this is musicians. I happen to be somewhat of a musician. And I've talked to a lot of musicians through the years, and there's no doubt that there's a God-given thing called musicianship where you have it or you don't. You can learn certain chops, you can learn to do certain things, but that doesn't make it musical. That comes from a gift that God gives. Okay? I was listening to Dominic Wyant playing the saxophone yesterday over at Miriam and David's birthday shower, and that kid, I think he has the gift. In other words, he wasn't just playing notes, it sang. You know, it was a little song that he's taught himself. It was singing, okay? Well, what am I talking about? There was a particular pianist that I knew back in Central Ohio back in the 90s who was just a phenomenal pianist. She could do stuff with the piano that I could never dream of doing. And I remember one particular conversation with her. We were talking about that gift that has been given and how people will often remark to her, you know, oh, what a gift you had, Amy. What a gift you have. And she was just being honest with me. She was saying, sometimes it bothers me when people say that to me because they don't see the thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of hours I have spent in a rehearsal room working over things that I can't get right. They don't see the sweat in the work, in the tears, in the anger, and the frustration that enables me to take this gift and do that. They just assume that if they had that gift, oh, I could play like you. You don't know. You watch professional athletes out on the field or out on the court, and you think, oh, if I only had that gift, and you don't know the years, if it's all cumulative, the years that go into the training and the weight room and all of that. And you just say, oh, I would just like the gift. Well, here's what I see God doing in Joseph. You know that Joseph had an extraordinary administrative gift. I hope, well, at least if you read the story before, you've heard the story, it's clear that Joseph had an extraordinary administrative gift. And as you see the story unfold, it becomes clear that there's nobody in Egypt who is his rival to his organizational skills, his wisdom at administrating things. But think about all the hours in the practice room. Where did Joseph get those hours in the practice room? Right here. Joseph is a young boy. He's sold as a slave where he grows in administration to the point where he's running the household for his Egyptian master. And then he gets thrown in the slammer. And what does he do? He starts administrating things to the point where the guy who's supposed to be doing it doesn't have to do it anymore. Joseph is running the whole prison. He is learning these administrative chops, if you will, these leadership skills, these character traits of always getting up again, of continuing to love and serve people even if they kick you in the stomach. He's learning all of this on the job. This is intense on-the-job training. So God is cultivating all of this stuff that's going to play so extraordinarily in the future in Joseph's life. He's cutting his chops now as a slave and then an imprisoned slave. Often when you read the story, you're not thinking about that. Where do you think that came from? That's where it came from. Yeah, he had a gift, but it had to be developed. So it's being developed now. And I thought to myself, where in your own life can you look back to a certain point, and maybe it was a certain point that felt like futility for you? It felt like it was a waste of your time. It was unpleasant. It was painful. It didn't seem significant to you in any way. But now, from the point where you are in life, you can look back at it and say, that came in pretty handy. Maybe it was a connection that you formed with a person, or maybe it was an experience that you had, or maybe it was a season of life that you had to live through that developed certain things in you. And now you can look back and say, this is what God did with that. You know, I look back at my whole college education, and I think probably the most valuable part of my college education was extracurricular activity. Because you know what my extracurricular activity was? Every weekend, I was with a group that went and sang in churches. When I went to college, I was 10 years out of college before I realized that I thought I needed to be in pastoral ministry. But you know what I had done? I'd spent years going to churches and leading in worship services, either with a choir or with a singing group, because that's what I did. So it's the most natural thing in the world later to see, well, this is what God was doing. I didn't know it at the time. I wouldn't have selected it at the time. But it sort of was handed to me, and it cut my chops, so to speak. You can probably see something like that in your own life. So you see the hand of providence in Joseph's life in his imprisonment. There was an inspirational poster when I was young. People used to hang it on their walls, and you still hear the phrase sometimes, but it was the phrase, bloom where you are planted, right? If that doesn't describe Joseph, I don't think it describes anything. No matter where Joseph found himself, he bloomed, no matter how many kicks in the gut he got. So here's Joseph going. He's prospering, again, in situations where you and I would look and say, that doesn't look like prospering to me. He's in prison, but yet God is prospering him. Look at what's happening here. So he takes on more and more responsibility without the title. Now look at verse 10. I'm sorry, this is Luke 16:10. These are the words of Jesus, and this is what it reminded of me. Whoever can be trusted with very little can also be trusted with very much. Is that not Joseph? Does Joseph not flesh that out for you so your eyes can see it? That's Joseph. Now, another way that I see the providential hand of God at work behind the scenes in Joseph's bogus imprisonment is in this way. God was providentially providing for Joseph through this imprisonment certain connections that would be crucial in his future. I don't know if you've ever analyzed the story in this way or not, but that is true. We've seen the providential hand of God working in Joseph's life in all kinds of ways, traced back to the point where his brothers decided to sell him as a slave rather than murder him, which was on the table. And we see him winding up in Egypt, a land that he never would have chosen to go to, but he winds up having to live there as a slave. And we know how important his being in Egypt is going to be in another 15 to 20 years. But he didn't know it at the time. So how does he get to this position where he's going to be so important in the life of a whole region of the world? Well, it starts right here, in prison. He's making connections with certain people. Now, who does he make connections with here? It's fascinating that these are, I would call them white-collar criminals, or suspected white-collar criminals. Now, what kind of a criminal is Joseph besides being a falsely accused one? He's a foreigner. He's a slave. He's a Hebrew slave living in Egypt. So don't tell me you don't have class structure in a prison. You got class structure. So you got some white-collar criminals here, some guys who are thrown into the prison from high-ranking positions. They're officials, the passage calls them, in the court of the king of Egypt, Pharaoh. They're actually called terms that I don't think do it quite justice. The cupbearer and the chief baker. Basically, you got a man who's in charge of the vineyards of the Pharaoh, and a man who's in charge of all the confections that feed the palace. The head cook, if you will, the head baker. So they're called officials. So they're probably, I would call them white-collar people who are accused of a crime. Now, the passage does not tell us what crime they were accused of. It just says that Pharaoh had a falling out with them. And I'm going to suspect, a lot of people think, and I'm thinking that this is kind of feasible, that there may have been some sort of an assassination attempt on the king, and it might have been a poisoning thing. And these two guys are in charge of everything that Pharaoh eats. Okay? So it's quite possible, and even it's quite feasible, that these guys were somehow thought to have been involved in an assassination plot. And so they wind up thrown in a dungeon. What dungeon? The one where Joseph is. And so who's in charge of meeting the needs of all the people who are thrown in the dungeon now? Joseph. Now, how do you think those white-collar guys felt about this Hebrew slave who's in prison? Probably not real kindly. You know, there's this divide. And yet Joseph, day after day after day after day, serves them. And he cares about them. And he invests himself in their well-being and their interests as he administrates. This is what's extraordinary about him. So if you were going to write a story about how some Hebrew slave winds up having the ear of somebody connected with the king of Egypt, how would you make that happen? This is how God made it happen. So now Joseph is mixed up in the lives of a couple of guys who have the ear of the king of Egypt, even though they're in trouble with him right now. And that is going to come big into play in the days that follow. So there is a third way now that I see the providential hand of God at work behind the scenes in Joseph's imprisonment. It is the fact that God is using Joseph now in a prison. No matter where he is, God is using him. He's now impacting the lives of people in a prison. Don't discount that. It's very big. In other words, the people in prison are getting to know a man who has a relationship with a living God, the likes of which they have never seen. They are witnessing the work ethic and the spirit of a man who knows the real God. Now, they all believe in gods. They're polytheists. They're Egyptians. But they don't know this God. And this is a unique and extraordinary man. Now, I want you to watch the way Joseph's character comes into play here as he serves them in the prison. This is verses 6 and 7. When Joseph came to them the next morning, who's the them? These two prisoners, the cupbearer and the chief baker of Egypt. Okay? He comes to them next morning, so it gives you the idea that, okay, he makes his rounds regularly, and he's used to checking in on them. And it says, when he came to them the next morning, he saw that they were dejected. Now, what does that tell you about Joseph? He checked in on them regularly. What else? He's perceptive. He's sensitive. He actually is paying attention to people. He's not going through motions. Read between the lines. He perceives that they are dejected. And look what he does. So he asks Pharaoh's officials who were in custody with him in this master's house, which is another term for the dungeon here. why do you look so sad today? Now, can we just talk about this for a moment? Does that sound to you like the behavior of a person who is self-absorbed? Does that sound to you like the behavior of a person who's wallowing in self-pity because he's been wrongfully accused and thrown in prison? Why do you look so sad today? You know, again, back in the mid-90s, I heard this phrase used by somebody in my life there. I'll put it up on the screen for you. People don't care how much you know until they know how much you care. Do you think that's true? It's entirely true. It doesn't matter what you know. If they don't know that you care, they don't really care how much you know. Okay? So, in other words, if you're going to minister to people on behalf of God, you're going to have to care a little bit about people. Notice how it worked in Joseph's life, both in Potiphar's house and now in the prison. Notice how it works. Joseph has obviously showed a lot of care and concern for these guys, and he asked them, "What's up, guys? You don't look well." And what do? They divulge their spiritual concerns to a Hebrew slave who's been imprisoned. These white-collar guys, they're dumping their guts on this Hebrew slave. And the reality of that truism is again reinforced. They know how much Joseph cares, so they're interested in what he has to say. Now look how it develops. "We both had bad dreams," they answered, "but there's no one to interpret them." Then Joseph said to them, "Don't interpretations belong to God?" The understood answer is, yes, at least Joseph thinks so. So what does he say? Tell God your dreams. No, what does he say? I can't hear you. Tell me your dreams. Does that sound a little weird to you? If God has the answers, why would they tell Joseph? Joseph has such a confidence in his connection with God that he's willing to say, if you tell me your dreams, I'll be able to tell you God's meaning behind them. That's gutsy. That's gutsy. That's confidence. And apparently the men believe him. I'm telling you, this is the impact that Joseph had on people. He was impacting people. So the passage continues. So the chief cupbearer told Joseph his dream, and he said to him, "In my dream, I saw a vine in front of me, and on the vine were 3 branches. As soon as it budded, it blossomed, and its clusters ripened into grapes. Pharaoh's cup was in my hand, and I took the grapes, and I squeezed them into Pharaoh's cup, and put the cup in Pharaoh's hand." So you see how he's in charge of the vineyards of Pharaoh and making sure of safe delivery of all of this to Pharaoh. And Joseph says, this is what it means. I don't know how much hem-hawing around there was in between, but Joseph says, here's what it means. The 3 branches are 3 days. Within 3 days, Pharaoh will lift up your head and restore you to your position. And you will put Pharaoh's cup in his hand just as you used to do when you were his cupbearer. Now I'm going to skip ahead. I'm going to come back to these verses in between here. And I'm going to tell you that the other white-collar accused criminal sees that the first one gets a favorable interpretation, and so he's all in. And he tells Joseph his dream. And much to his chagrin, it does not have a favorable outcome for him. Basically, Joseph tells him, within 3 days, your head's going to be sliced off and you'll be impaled on a pole. And the birds will eat your flesh while you hang there. Now, Joseph, he can give you the good news. Joseph can give you the bad news. He's just shooting straight. But what is fascinating to me about this is that these men share their innermost struggles with Joseph as though Joseph were some sort of a priest or some sort of a prophet. Because Joseph is being used by God as a connector between himself and people, even while he's in a dungeon. It reminds me of the Apostle Paul in the New Testament. Really, the fact that I was thrown into prison for this has only turned out for the good, because half of Caesar's households become Christ followers. Okay, you see? Your circumstances, you just want to sour and moan about them? why don't we do as Joseph did and just seize the opportunity that's put before us by the hardship? This is what we've got to learn from Joseph. Now then, the rest of this passage tells us what happened. And I don't read it for you. I just tell you. I'll summarize it for you. What Joseph said came to pass. All those things happened. And what kind of an impact do you think that had, at least on the official who survived? My goodness. Now, we need to pause for just a minute. Am I going to tell you that based upon Joseph's experience, you all need to find somebody to interpret your dreams for you? I am not going to tell you that. Don't walk away from this with that idea. Now, clearly God has used dreams in the past, but this was never the norm. It was never for everybody, nor was it meant to be perpetual for all people. No, these were rare things. Even when you read the scriptures, you see these things, and you feel like you see it all over the place in the scriptures, but these were extraordinary events, extraordinary people, extraordinary moments. This wasn't the run-of-the-mill function. And even today, I believe God reserves the right to reveal himself in a dream to people. I think he's been doing that among Muslims. It's extraordinary to read what's happening in some places. But this is not the norm. It's an extraordinary thing. So, please do not run out having concluded that you need to understand your dreams because God's trying to tell you something. No, your dreams can mean a million different things, and none of them might be a message from God. So please don't do that. That is not the point. But in this case, God is using Joseph for a specific purpose. Now, the fourth way that I see the providential hand of God at work behind the scenes in Joseph's life in ways that Joseph did not know, and you and I would not have known, is this. God was using this imprisonment of Joseph for the encouragement of believers down through the centuries, as you and I sit here 4,000 years later and talk about Joseph's life. Think about that. Do you know what's going to happen with your experiences 4,000 years from now? Of course not. You never know those things. But do you trust that God can do something, whatever he wants, even if you don't get it? The answer is yes. I hope you trust him for that, because that was what made the difference for Joseph. Now, I want you to look back at verses 14 or 15, because this, to me, this is the most powerful part of the message. Maybe it's just because of where I'm at in my life, so this message keeps coming out of me no matter what passage I look at. I was talking to my wife about this week. Certain periods of your life, you go through something, and it just, no matter where you look in the Bible, you see the same theme bleeding out. Okay? Well, look at this. Verses 14 and 15. Joseph tells the first guy what his dream meant, and he gives him good news. You're going to be restored to your position, dude. Now, look what Joseph says. Look at the next words out of his mouth. But when all goes well with you, remember me, show me kindness, mention me to Pharaoh, and get me out of this prison. I was forcibly carried off from the land of the Hebrews. I didn't ask to be here. And even here, I've done nothing to deserve being put in a dungeon. I don't think Joseph said it the way I just did it. I'm just helping you to see the emotion. If you think Joseph was a robot, you are missing something extremely important. And one of my passions in these latter years of my life has been to correct what I think has been an injustice that's done when we look at these people in the Bible. We make them flat and one-dimensional, as though they didn't feel, that they didn't hurt, that they didn't struggle. Do you not hear Joseph's pain? Do you see Joseph's struggle? I didn't ask to be brought here. This hurts. And yet, he's continually trying to honor his God, trust his God, serve his God, and serve the people that are in his life, even though he is terribly hurt, terribly lost, terribly confused. And he's saying, would you please help me? Put in a word with your boss, the king, when you get out of here. Now remember all these gut punches that are coming in sequence for Joseph? Guess what happens? Another kick in the gut. What verse is it? Verse 23. The chief cupbearer, however, did not remember Joseph. He forgot him. Thanks, dude. Can I just say that this passage makes me very angry? How dare you get out of prison and forget that Hebrew slave who connected you with God, who served you, who cared about you. This keeps happening to Joseph. I don't know whether he literally slipped his mind, which I cannot comprehend that really happening, or if it was just that, I'm going to wait till there's a more opportune time, and that time just never came. Because it probably wasn't good to mention being in a dungeon with Hebrew slaves and stuff like that when you're in the presence of the king. It probably didn't serve him well to bring up Joseph's request. And so he just never did. And you guys, you know how much longer Joseph spent in prison? 2 more years. 2 more years, because Mr. Cupbearer doesn't bother to tell the king. How do you keep from souring? I'm souring just thinking about it. How do you keep from souring? We have to learn this from Joseph. Because if you're going to live in this world, you're going to get hurt. People are going to be unfaithful. This is one thing we're seeing is that, guys, people are fickle. This story is real, and this is you all. This is me. You will let each other down. People will let you down. The only one who will not let you down, the only one who will not forget you, is Joseph's God. Your God. And it reminded me of the words of Isaiah the prophet in chapter 49, where he's paraphrasing God, and he says, can a woman forget, this is God talking, can a woman forget her nursing child and have no compassion on the son of her womb? The answer is no. Even these may forget, but I will not forget you. Behold, I have inscribed you on the palms of my hands, says the Lord God Almighty about you. And Joseph believed this. Even though the cupbearer forgets him, he believes God has not forgotten him, which is what enables him to go on and not become absolutely useless to the rest of the human race. Will you hold on to that?